नमस्कार दोस्तों, सबसे पहले आप सभी का स्वागत है आपके अपने चैनल IITIAN मैकेनिकल वाला पर। मेरे प्यारे दोस्तों, आज की क्लास की शुरुआत हम करने जा रहे हैं रिप्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ फोर्स के साथ। तो सबसे पहले क्वेश्चन राइज होता है माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, टू स्पेसिफाई ए फोर्स कंप्लीटली व्हाट इज रिक्वायर्ड। ओके, और फोर्स के बारे में हमने लास्ट क्लास में पढ़ा था कंसेप्ट ऑफ फोर्स given by Newton's first law of motion, then measurement of force by Newton's second law of motion. And in today's class we will also study about Newton's third law of motion, my dear friends. Okay, but you have to wait for that moment. Okay, so now let us answer this question first. To specify force completely, what is required? Okay, my dear friends. So very simple answer, my dear friends. Its magnitude. So what is required, my dear friends? Its magnitude. Magnitude of force, my dear friends. Point of application of force. Point of application of force or line of action of force. Line of action of force. And last is, my dear friends, sense, nature of force. Sense or nature of force, my dear friends. Sense or nature of force. Whether it is pull or push, my dear friends. Whether it is pull or push. So to specify the force completely, the magnitude, point of application, line of action, and nature of force are required, my dear friends. Okay, now let us move to next question. Very important question, my dear friends. In how many ways force can be represented? Okay, so फोर्स को कितने तरीकों से हम रिप्रेजेंट कर सकते हैं? सो वेरी सिंपल आंसर, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. देयर आर टू वेज, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. सो ए फोर्स कैन बी रिप्रेजेंटेड इन टू वेज, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. एंड व्हाट आर दोस टू वेज, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स? फर्स्ट वन इज वेक्टर रिप्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ ए फोर्स. Vector representative force. And second one is Bose notation, my dear friends. Bose notation. Vector representation force का कैसे होता है, अभी हम उसके बारे में पढ़ लेते हैं. सबसे पहले हम लेते हैं वेक्टर रिप्रेजेंटेशन, my dear friends. Vector representation. In this case, my dear friends, a force is represented by a vector. A force is represented by a vector. Very important, my dear friends. Now what is vector? Then such vector, what is vector? Vector is a straight line, my dear friends. Vector is a straight line. Vector is a straight line, my dear friends. Okay, drawn parallel to the line of action of force. Drawn parallel to the line of action of force, my dear friends. Be careful. Line of action of force. And also this line, one end of this line is shown by an arrow, and one end of straight line is marked by an arrow pointing the direction of or line of action of that force, my dear friends. Okay, so वेक्टर रिप्रेजेंटेशन में फोर्स को हम एक स्ट्रेट लाइन और उसको एक एरो से मार्क करके शो करते हैं. बट वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, इसमें सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट ऐसी कौन सी रिप्रेजेंटेशन है जिसके अंदर हम स्केल अज्यूम करते हैं. सो इन वेक्टर रिप्रेजेंटेशन माय डियर फ्रेंड्स, सो ग्राफिकली और ज्योमेट्रिकली और ज्योमेट्रिकली a force is represented by a vector. Okay, my dear friends. So in this we assume a scale, convenient scale. So let us take an example of a force of 10 Newton. We are taking an example. There is a force of 10 Newton, my dear friends. Now we need to assume a scale. Okay, so let us assume an appropriate convenient scale. 5 Newton is equal to 1 centimeter. Assumed scale, my dear friends. Be careful, because we are going to draw a force graphically with the help of a vector right now. Okay, so how much then 10 Newton, my dear friends? 2 centimeter, my dear friends. In graphs, so what we need to do, we need to draw a line, straight line of 2 centimeter. Okay, my dear friends, so let me draw that line. Very important, a straight line marked by an arrow. Okay, my dear friends. So now I am taking this force. Now in what direction? That's very important. So now I am assuming north, east, west, south, my dear friends. This is in direction north, south, east and west. Okay, so I am now I am taking, okay, system of directions. So now this force is now, let us suppose this is due east, my dear friends. Okay, due east 10 Newton. Now very important direction, I have taken magnitude, but direction was not taken. So now we also take its direction. A force of 10 Newton is acting in east direction. Okay, due east, my dear. So now I am taking it as in east direction. Okay, so this is a straight line length of how much you need to draw on graph. It is 2 centimeter. That is what vector. Okay, very important, my dear friends. So this is nothing but this is vector. Okay, how much? 2 centimeter. And basically what it is, force of 10 Newton acting in east direction. Okay, be careful, on a point, on a body. Okay, very important, my dear friends. It may be whether it push or pull type, that's not a problem, but this was all about vector representation of a force by graphical approach. Okay, आगे पढ़ते हैं बोज नोटेशन के बारे में. वेरी सिंपल, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. नाउ लेट अस मूव टू बोज नोटेशन. In Bose notation, a force is represented by two capital letters. A force is represented by two capital letters. For designated, we can say, my dear friends, a force is designated. Okay, represented, or you can also write it as designated by two capital letters written on either side. Written on either side of that force. That force. Very important, my dear friends. Or naming of force in this representation of force, Bose notation, is done either clockwise direction or anti-clockwise direction, my dear friends. मेरा कहने का तात्पर्य क्या है, अब इस बात को आप ध्यान से समझना. Let us suppose there is this point, okay, and force is acting over there, and another force is also there, another force is also there. So in Bose notation, a force is designated by two capital letters written on either side of that force. So यहाँ पर मैं force लेने जा रहा हूँ, AB force. What is it? This is force, but this is different force. I am now designating it by two capital letters. One side is A letter and this side is B letter. Okay, my dear friends. And now I am taking this force also. I am now designating by B and C. Okay, we are taking like that. So then this vector will be force. Not vector, force. This force, my dear friends, will be represented by or designated by A, C or C. Now clockwise direction or anti-clockwise. That's very important, my dear friends. Okay. So let us take clockwise direction. So then how we will write this force then? AB force, my dear friends. Be careful in clockwise direction. In clockwise direction of naming of force, my dear friends. Naming of force or designating force, my dear friends. So in clockwise sense, first we will write AB force, then BC force, my dear friends, then CA force. In clockwise manner, be careful, my dear friends, then CA. So this is naming of force in clockwise sense. Okay. In this, in anti-clockwise sense, it will be, my dear friends, BA, AC and CB. The reverse of that, my dear friends, BA, CB and AC, my dear friends. In this, but very important question is that what is the advantage of Bose notation? That's very important. In this case, my dear friends, a force can be identified. A force AB, BC or CA can be easily identified as shown by two capital letters by writing two capital letters in the small case form, lower case form, my dear friends. So these two capital letters A and B we will write as small letters. Okay. So now I am taking this force A to B, my dear friends. AB force I am taking right now. For example, this is AB force. Be careful, my dear friends. Okay. So I am taking this. This is nothing, my dear friend. I am taking this AB force. Now it will be shown like small A to B, and these two capital letters, okay, my dear, will be written as small letters. So now a force can be easily identified, which is represented or designated by two capital letters written on its either side by writing these two capital letters now in small form at the end of that vector A to B. But this is not graphical approach. Here no scale is assumed, my dear friends. So very important in both notation, no scale is assumed. No scale is assumed. But in this graphical method, an appropriate scale is assumed, my dear friends. Be careful, okay? So this is very, very important, my dear friends. Now let us start. Now next topic, my dear friends. So now next question is very important question, my dear friends. How a force can affect a body, or what are the effects of a force on a body, my dear friends? Okay, we have already studied about this. And what are the effects? What are those effects? Let me write. Okay. So first I am going to answer this question. A force can change the state of a body. Very important. A force may change state of body. What does it mean, my dear friends? A body can be moved. A body can be moved with a different velocity. Okay, so there can be a change in the velocity of body, my dear friends. So what does it mean? If a body is slower, then that body can move faster. If a body is moving faster, then that body can be moved slowly. Okay, so this is the state of a body. A force may change the velocity of a body. Very important, my dear friends. Now, second effects. A force may change the shape or size of a body, my dear friends. May change the shape or size of a body. This is this second fact. Now third one, a force can also change the direction. A force may change the direction of a body. Now, very important, my dear friends, a force may give rise to stresses. May give rise to stresses in the body, my dear friends. In a body. What does it mean? जब किसी बॉडी पे फोर्स लगता है तो उस बॉडी के अंदर इंटरनली स्ट्रेसेस डेवलप हो सकती हैं. ऐसा होता है, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. सो these are the facts of a force on the body, my dear friends. Very easy. I already explained about all these things. Okay, so now let us move to next question. Very important, my dear friends. What are the characteristics of a force? And these are the actually specification of a force, my dear friends, and we have already studied this. First question of today class, how a force can be specified, what are the requirements. So answer of this question is same, my dear friends. What are the characteristics of a force? Magnitude. Let us take an example, 20 Newton. So what is magnitude? So this is magnitude, my dear friends. Very important. Value of force. And what is this Newton? This is SI, unit of force, my dear friends, given by Sir Isaac Newton. Very important. Okay. So what are the characteristics of a force? These are very important, my dear friends. Unit, magnitude of a force, point of application of force, point or direction of force, point of application, my dear friends, direction of force, or sense or nature of force, sense or nature of force, my dear friends, whether it is pull or push. This is simple, whether it is pull or push, my dear friends. So this is the answer of this question, my dear friends. So let us move to next question.